All right, we'll get going with this stuff. Good morning, everybody. I hope you all had a nice weekend. So Friday, we almost finished the GI tract. There's just a handful of helminths left to talk about, just a few slides. So I left you with the pinworms. Enterobius vermicularis is the pinworm. I know whenever it was, one of the earlier chapters, first chunk of material, I think we talked a bit about pinworms just as an introductory to some of the worms. Pinworms are a type of nematode. They're a roundworm. So with that, this image, and I'm not going to go through all sorts of details. We've got, again, some tables that go through this, and I know we talked a bit about Enterobius and some of the potentials with that before, so I'm not going to rehash that. But you can see a couple of images here with the actual worms. These guys are really very small. Females, a few millimeters long, and males, maybe about a millimeter, if I remember correctly. Maybe they're 2 millimeters. The eggs, this is an electron micrograph, or not an electron, sorry, just a microscopic image. So micrograph of the eggs, which make them look gigantic compared to the worms over there. That's not the same, all right? So these, looking at them through the microscope, probably a Scotch tape prep or a tape prep, where we can see these eggs that have been defecated, or not defecated, they have been released by the worm around the anus of typically the child, and we can see that by collecting. So we'll see some more details with that. Tricura is the whipworm, and here we can see an image of the worm. It does look like a whip. Here's an egg, and we can see the operculum. This is where the larva will hatch out, and then a potential with this, and this is definitely more common in little kids for this to occur. Rectal prolapse is a consequence of whipworm infection. There are a plethora of other worms, but whipworms are the ones that basically have the opportunity to cause this. The rectum loses its attachment to the internal body structure and will protrude out. And that's definitely a consequence of whipworm infection. We'll skip away from that. And again, there's tables that we'll go through and describe some of this stuff and how we contract it and potentially treat it. Another roundworm, another nematode, Trichinella spiralis, is a pork roundworm. I think we talked about Taenia solium, the pork tapeworm, in the last chunk of material, unless last time, I mean, unless I'm mistaken and we're going to hit them again, but I think we've mentioned it. So there are all sorts of different things, and tapeworms and roundworms, both possibilities to be transmitted through poorly cooked pork meat. Here we can see a couple of images, 2 different images. So a few of these larval stages encysted within the musculature, and then another image of it. And this is, so probably pork, and then this is bear meat. Similar, and both potentials for it. So the larval stage gets into the animal, the pig or the bear, respectively, and once it gets into the musculature of that animal, so the egg ingested, hatching, and then within the musculature forming these cysts. We call these nurse cells, and the cyst basically, as it gets into a muscle cell, it causes, well, that muscle cell is no longer a muscle cell. It's basically a nursery. The larval organism resides within that cell. It redirects the blood supply. It causes angiogenesis. So blood vessels come in and start to feed it better, giving it ample nourishment. So this cell basically, like I said, is now just a nursery feeding this larval stage in the hopes that something's going to eat it. And then as that larval stage, that nurse cell gets ingested, it will grow as the adult stage of the worm within the intestines. As I mentioned with the pork tapeworm, this is also an opportunity where we can serve as an intermediary host and see this stuff happening in our musculature as well. If we happen through poor hygiene to consume the egg, it will do the same thing within us. And so kind of a rarity. And it also makes me question what's up behind that. How is it that in two different types of worm infections, both in pigs, where they are serving as an intermediary host, do we see ourselves also with that opportunity? The definitive for sure, but we also could be intermediary hosts. I think that's interesting. My gut tells me I'll see some threads on Packback thinking about that. I think it's pretty interesting to kind of think a little more about. So I was wrong. Here's Taenia sole, and here's our pork tapeworm. For some reason, I thought we already showed tapeworms. Maybe it was just my rack of worms that I brought in last time. So the pork tapeworm, Taenia solium, has some hooks around the scolex, the head of the worm, and there are a few other things, but that's definitely something that helps us to differentiate it from the beef tapeworm that doesn't have any sort of ornamentation, is what we would call it, any of these extra stuff. The hooks help for attachment, so too do the suckers, all right? And that's what we're seeing up on here. These, the roundworms will pull in nutrients. They've got a complete digestive tract, mouth to anus. Tapeworms, flatworms, they're not the same. They don't have, although they've got digestive tract, it's not the same sort of an idea. They absorb nutrients directly through their skin, their tegument. So these suckers up here aren't sucking in nutrients. It's just like a suction cup, a hold fast, right? Nutrients get absorbed directly through the tegument. And each of the proglottids has the potential to harbor massive amounts of eggs. That's this image right here is a single egg. This would be either a proglottid, a chunk of this worm would break off, the tail end of it, that would be full of eggs, and that would be released out into the environment, or it potentially ruptures, releasing those eggs, which in turn are defecated out and released into the environment. It depends on the circumstances with this, as far as if these become something that's able to be ingested by a pig, or if we're talking other animals with other worms, same idea, all right? So Taenia solium is the pork tapeworm, Taenia saginata is the beef tapeworm. Similar ideas with that, but as I was describing, these guys have the opportunity through poor hygiene for the egg to be ingested by us, and then we would have cysts within our musculature as an opportunity. Here are a couple of different flukes. So tapeworms and flukes are both flatworms, all right, but they are different in appearance, all right. These are not segmented. We don't see all sorts of super humongous lengths. The pork and beef tapeworm can kind of be huge. Beef tapeworm, a handful of meters. Pork tapeworm, probably a meter or two. Beef tapeworm, between 4 to 10 meters. Sometimes we think about elsewhere outside of the United States, upwards of 20 meters long. That's impressive, all right? The flukes don't get that big, all right? And there are some variations with these guys. The first one right here, in A is a liver fluke. Fasciola hepatica is the liver fluke. Fasciolipsis, similar sounding name, but different body site. These guys are intestinal flukes, all right? So sort of similar looking appearance, but where we might find them different, all right? Like the tapeworms, the flukes are also hermaphroditic. So a single worm has both sex organs. You only need one worm, and they can start generating massive amounts of eggs, all right? With that said, when we think about worms, although there are a few exceptions for some auto-infection, pinworms are kind of good for that. Most worms, when you get the adult stage of the worm within you, they're not proliferating inside of you. So if you get one tapeworm, you only have one tapeworm. Even if they're producing millions of eggs, those eggs aren't infecting you. And again, unless we're talking pork, right? They're really not. And that would also with the pork worms, through poor hygiene is the situation. It's not just always you get all of a sudden massive amounts of larval stages, all right? Flukes, hermaphroditic, producing typically numerous eggs, thousands or millions of eggs that they can be producing and releasing, which out into the environment kind of depends on the circumstances. With flukes, I mean, the life cycles are super complex, typically with multiple hosts involved. Oftentimes, a snail either living in the water or on the soil, dependent upon types of flukes. These guys need water snails. And the parasite in the egg, as it's defecated out, makes its way to the water. The egg hatches, it swims, we call it a miracidium. It swims very rapidly toward a snail, penetrates into it, and goes through numerous developmental stages that ultimately give rise to a juvenile form that will be infectious. There are differences with these as well. Sometimes this juvenile form can readily get into us, typically penetrating into the skin. There are lots of other opportunities where it needs to insist in some vegetation or something, maybe even another animal, and then through the consumption of that, you get infected, all right? It kind of just depends. With the liver flukes, typically these guys will insist on aquatic vegetation. Watercress is a good one for this stuff. And then the consumption of watercress brings the infection to you, all right? So in the case of liver flukes, jaundice conditions are oftentimes maybe your first instance of that, and then they start thinking some other details as we're trying to figure out what's up. Is it, one of the viral culprits for our hepatitis? Is there something else that could be going on? Could it potentially have been from your diet? If we recognize that these individuals have been consuming watercress, that should raise a flag. That should be on our radar almost instantaneously. That kind of depends on where you're at. In France, watercress is something that is relatively common to consume. And so when we see, liver issues, jaundice and other issues, and we look at their diet, that's when we start thinking some of those details, all right? And with our phagocytosis, if I recall properly, these guys, I don't think it's, I think it is vegetation, but it's not the same. It's not watercress, it's something slightly different. We'll see that shortly, I think. Let me stop the share, reshare. Okay, so this table, lists off a handful that we have seen and a few we haven't. And I also noticed, for one reason or another, there's a bit of redundancy on here. The whipworm, they got to talk about it twice, and I don't know why. Probably because that image of the rectal prolapse is pretty disturbing, all right? We won't talk about it twice. The Ascariasis, Ascaris lumbricoides, I brought in that tube with my big worm in there. That was that guy. The eggs are what's infectious in fecally contaminated food or water. We can identify them through looking at stool or through imaging. There's a handful of symptoms: shortness of breath, cough, nausea, diarrhea, blood in the stool, abdominal pain, weight loss, and fatigue. There are issues with this as it gets into us, and ultimately the egg needing to hatch, migrate, even though we think about it making its way into the GI tract, it bores out, migrates, and then makes its way back. Oftentimes parasites do some pretty crazy migrations, even though they may have found themselves in the intestine. They may need to migrate before they can fully say, this is where I want to be, all right? And some of that potentially goes back to thinking about possibilities of different hosts that once called these their parasites or intermediary hosts that required some of these types of migrations, and they still continue, all right? We talked about hookworms, Necator, and Ankylostoma. Although the image we showed was Ankylostoma canum, the one that doesn't truly call us the true host, and it stays localized in the skin. These are the two that really plague humans. So as we think about these, it's the larvae that typically infect us, although I did mention Ankylostoma. The larva can be infected, but the eggs also can. So a contamination issue, fecal oral transmission, can set the stage for contracting it. So there's similar ideas. The larvae penetrate into the skin, to the circulation, to the lungs, breaking out, coughed up, and swallowed down. So there's issues with that. There's a rash as the larva is penetrated into the skin. Loss of appetite, abdominal pain, diarrhea. There are all sorts of issues with little kids. If they become infected, it can stunt their growth. They can have cognitive impairment, all sorts of problems, all right? And we can see treatments over here, although I skipped over the first one. It could be self-limiting. Like I said, they're not proliferative in there, although we did see the image with the cross-section of the intestines where numerous eggs had been ingested. There were countless worms. But if you only have a handful of worms, they're not replicating, so they live out their lifespan a couple of years, done deal. Most of the time, with serious infection, we need treatment, all right? And these azole drugs are common with many, all right? Strongyloidiasis, Strongyloides stericralis, also larvae that are in the soil that penetrate through the skin. Similar ideas, the hookworm. And there's similar issues, sometimes asymptomatic, but coughing, which could potentially have some blood, skin rash, diarrhea, and then there's possibilities for dissemination and possible fatal consequence with that. Ivermectin is preferred. Albendazole, as we see with some of these, is another potential. And there are a couple, I believe down here, maybe this praziquantel, if I remember right, if it's used instead of this, thinking something else, that may compound effects. And I think this one was maybe the one, if I remember properly, sometimes with the cough, if you already have issues like asthma, all right, you may mistake that for an attack. You might think that you're having an asthma attack as you're coughing and having some difficulty breathing. And in turn, people with asthma grab their inhaler, they inhale a nice dose of some steroids. And as that happens, it causes these worms to replicate more rapidly, all right? And in the process of those eggs being defecated out, they can ultimately go through a couple of molts and become auto-infected in that circumstance. Typically, if you're not doing that, that's not going to happen, all right? Kind of crazy. Fun fact, all right? We saw the Enterobius, the pinworm, fecal oral eggs are common for identification, but sometimes the worm as well. There's issues, and it really depends on the circumstances. Little kids often exhibit lots of issues with this. So itching around the anus, abdominal pain, insomnia, irritation, all sorts of possibilities with that, all right? Some azoles, and it's something that requires a pretty rigorous decontamination of the house because the eggs are highly contaminated and get all over the place. The whipworm, Trichuris trichura, another fecal contamination, and we saw those images. There's pain, anemia, diarrhea, that also could potentially be bloody. Trichinella spiralis, trichinosis, that roundworm. We see ingestion of poorly cooked or raw pork or other meat, bear meat is important with that, but it also kind of depends on where you're at, all right? There are all sorts of infections with this. It's a global situation, all right? So kind of depends on where you're at if we're thinking about hunting situations, all right? In areas like Africa, some areas of Africa, hyena could be culprits for that. I don't know if that's something that I would think would be very tasty, but maybe, all right? They're kind of scavengers eating all sorts of things. So that kind of begs the question, would that be something you would want to eat in the first place? Maybe, right? As I said, bears, I think a couple of other wild game animals potentially could harbor that, but usually that's the case, all right? The tenias, the tapeworms, there are a handful, all right? As we think about these, the Taenia solium, as we were showing, is the pork tapeworm. Saginata is the beef one. Asiatica. I can't remember where this one's coming from. I think it's, well, whatever, doesn't matter. Cephalobothrum is coming out of fish. So many worms. So raw or undercooked meat serve as the source of infection for that. Moving down, cystic echinococcosis hydatid disease is the case with this. In these circumstances, we're not harboring the adult stage of the worm. All of these others, we've been talking about that, all right? Echinococcosis, in this case, typically it's dogs that serve as the definitive hosts. They release eggs. We potentially get infected through a contamination situation like that. It says livestock too, but dogs are really kind of the top of the list for being common with that. So it gets into our body and potentially causes some serious damage as these cysts start to grow. If they're in areas that are kind of unhindered, able to proliferate in size, they can be gigantic, all right? And the potential, if that cyst ruptures, for a severe allergic reaction, anaphylactic shock, and fatality is definitely an issue, all right? Which we've got on there as a possibility. The liver flukes, Phaseola hepatica, and a handful of others, all right? Gigantica, Clonorhynchus, Opisthoorchis, a couple of different species of them, all liver flukes, and differences as far as how we are becoming infected, but a lot of similarity with it. So undercooked plants, there are also freshwater fish with the Clonorhynchus, and then I think the Opisthoorchis is also potentially vegetation, if I remember properly. So all sorts of issues with this. And again, these are within the liver. The phaseolipsis is the intestinal fluke. So undercooked aquatic plants as well, little bit different, but same sort of an idea, all right? And then I think This, I don't know why these are continued, because every single one of these, I believe we've already mentioned, right? I think we did. Okay. Because it's just so stinking awesome is why they had to repeat it. All right. I think that was potentially all of this chapter. Yes. So lastly, I typically just skip these bits or have deleted off the exercises. I left this on here because I think this is awesome. I also think it's a bit disturbing. So this image, we've mentioned Giardia. These are protists. So we mentioned Giardia last time, but we never actually saw any details. We never saw any pictures. So these are the little protists. We're looking at them. This is the intestine of somebody, and then all of the parasites all over. So a bunch of little flagella coming off. It's sort of sad we don't see one of them flipped around the other way. They've got some gigantic suckers on the bottom that allows them to attach or adhere to the intestinal cells. And there are opportunities for these to basically entirely cover all of the surface area when we're thinking like the duodenum, where they really want to be. That sets the stage for some serious issues, all right? Lastly, as I've got these on here before we shift over to the next stuff, it depends on your circumstances when we're thinking about trying to identify these parasites. Giardia causes some pretty serious diarrhea. And in those circumstances, if you were to look at that through the microscope, you'd see these trophozoites, the flagellated form. If you have the opportunity to not have diarrhea, to actually have some solid stool, those cysts are able to form. And so and that's what's infectious to us, are the cysts, not the trophozoites, right? So if solid stool is able to actually form, the trophozoite goes into the cyst stage, and then you see kind of egg-looking a cyst that's formed with this parasite. It would be found in the feces. So it kind of depends, all right? One last tidbit, if you do have some pretty good diarrhea going on with these guys, and you're looking at this stuff, you're not, because you're probably dying, right? Or you think you are. As they look at this and start making some evaluations, they speculate a single diuretic stool, all right? So one bout of diarrhea can have upwards of 14 billion trophozoites within there. Awesome, right? I would say we could classify that as a true buttload of parasites, right? 14 billion's gotta be described like that, right? I think that's pretty impressive. All right, enough of little Giardia. Okay. Shifting gears. The circulatory and lymphatic systems, as I described, I think lots of details of, all sorts of things with respiratory or GI tract infections. Not that the other body sites aren't important. And the very next slide, another parasite, but a parasite of the circulatory system has plagued humanity since for forever. So I don't want to discount infections with any body site. There are still some serious and concerning organisms everywhere that can plague us. So there are numerous types of infections targeting the circulatory system, and a lot of infections we think about as some sort of arthropod-borne infection, arboviruses like yellow fever. are arthropod-borne viruses. And when we think about these, the arboviruses, they're all transmitted by mosquitoes, all right? Plethora of different things that mosquitoes can transmit. And there's also a huge amount of species of mosquitoes. It's not just one type of mosquito, all right? There's a bunch of different types of mosquitoes, some mosquitoes transmitting some stuff and other mosquitoes transmitting different stuff, all right? Kind of just depends on the circumstances. There's also opportunities for mosquitoes to harbor a handful of different pathogens and transmit multiple things to you simultaneously. Why not, right? So this one, yellow fever, is a hemorrhagic disease. It is something here we can see in this individual signs of jaundice, right? And we can see the Aedes aegypti mosquito that's taking a blood meal. I always get impressed with these images where you can see her abdomen is all bright red as she's taking a blood meal, all right? A little fun fact, almost always when we think about bugs feeding on us, they are female, all right? Males almost never take blood meals from people. It's females and they want all of the nutrients for their eggs, all right? There are a couple of insects, and I'm not going to get bogged down with that. There are a couple of insects that males and females will both feed on you, but for the most part, it's the female, all right? So that's why I said you can see her abdomen all full of blood, right? Impressive. So with that said, as they are feeding upon us, all right, sucking up blood, they're also injecting saliva and anticoagulants, analgesics. There's all sorts of stuff. Typically, when you get some sort of thing feeding on you, if it really wants to feed on you, it's going to create a situation where you don't know it, right? By injecting some of these analgesics, you don't feel the bite. You don't recognize it. You only recognize you're being fed on a mosquito if you look down and see it on your arm or wherever, right? And they're like, ah, right? And you probably slap it, right? That's when you recognize it, right? Otherwise, you don't feel it. You don't know, right? And that lets it do its job. Get a good meal of blood, and potentially also, as it's pumping that stuff into you, it's inoculating you with whatever sorts of pathogens, in this case, yellow fever, all right? So we will talk more details with this. So it kind of depends on circumstances. It can be very serious and possibly fatal, but maybe not, all right? And if I recall with yellow fever, I want to say right now, I don't think there is a actual specific treatment for that. So that's a big problem. So here we can see just a quick rundown of the circulatory system, heart, arteries, veins, and capillaries. And we can see this, like if we're moving down into the tissues, capillary bed, where we've got arterial and venous flow as the two come in and merge within these capillaries, where gas exchange is happening. And so all sorts of potentials for, organisms to spread throughout the body, and issues as we see that. We're thinking about stuff that, like the hemorrhagic fevers or other things targeting this. There are other opportunities where some bacteria could be causing infection, and then they're able to make their way into the circulatory system, all right? And we would say septicemia, all right, as these pathogens like bacteria get in to the circulatory system. If we're talking bacteria, we would say bacteremia. Other things, different stuff, virus, viremia, fungi, fungemia, any enias, we're thinking within the circulation, all right? So here's the lymphatics, and we're talking about both with this, really kind of the body's drainage system as we think about the lymphatic system. And it removes fluid from the tissues. It does come back up in here into the heart, and we bring it all back into the circulatory system. We will talk about some potentials of different things plaguing either system as they are intertwined. Here we can see a blow up of part of this with the two working together. So the arterioles to the capillary beds, the flow of blood moving through here and then into the venules. The lymphatics is a one-way flow. From the tissues, fluid comes in and it moves as we see these arrows going through. So blockages can cause issues, right? Serious issues with that. And we showed some filariasis, I believe, in a previous couple chapters back. So some more details here. We've got an image of the spleen right here, kind of, sort of kidney bean shaped. And the spleen, part of the lymphatics, it serves as, there's multiple things that it's doing. It harbors some red cells. It helps to filter some of that stuff. It's got copious amounts of white blood cells within there as well. It helps to do some surveillance, preventing and surveying for potential pathogens within the circulatory tract, hopefully, all right? This image is a cross section of a lymph node where the lymph fluid is coming in. Like I said, single direction, right? So the lymph, get my pointer back, the lymph comes in as it gets into the node. It gives the lymph fluid the ability to kind of slow and kind of cycle around so that immune cells can do some surveillance of this lymphatic fluid and recognize if there's potential issues. It gives it a chance to act, all right? So it moves in here, kind of cycles through, giving it an opportunity to be visualized. And we showed in the video some details about some of this quite a bit back. And then basically moving out from that. So swollen lymph nodes indicate something going on. What? We don't know for sure, but something where we've got immune cells that have been activated to respond to something, all right? This image, we've got some heart valves with bacterial vegetation, so some growth on here. Subacute bacterial endocarditis of the mitral valve. Here you can see the, what is this, the chordate tendonae, is that what it's called? The heartstrings. We've got bacteria that's kind of yellowish growth within there. Okay, so a couple of images here, and I don't think this is the same. This looks different, but maybe. All right, so we've got a patient with gas gangrene. There are all sorts of things that I think about with this. The Clostridium is one of the main bacteria that we think about this. And Clostridium perfringens is a very good one. I think there are a couple of others that potentially, but I think it's the main one we think about with gangrene. So there's some discoloration, and there is these gas pockets that we're looking at through X-ray, showing some of this as well. So the bacterium is anaerobic. It likes to be in an area that's very devoid of oxygen. And as it's in there fermenting, it produces this gas that we can see in here, causing some of these little blebs or raised up bits as a result of that. Okay. Oh, so many good ones. This image right here doesn't look like that big of a deal, right? Just a little bit of a wound. It looks maybe a little bit infected, but it doesn't look that bad, right? Francisella tularensis is a serious pathogen, all right? And we can see an image of the actual bacteria, little coccal bacilli, right here, potentially isolated from this wound, probably not, all right? But this is a bacterium that is pretty common, we could say, maybe, all right? It kind of depends on your circumstances, all right? It is also something that is highly contagious, right? It is very dangerous. It is on the list from CDC as a potential biowarfare agent or concerns for that because of the severity of the infection and the high transmissibility, the contagiousness of this, even though that doesn't look like that big of a deal. All right. Francisella tularensis is oftentimes called rabbit fever. Rabbits can harbor this bacterium, and in turn, you could become infected. All right. So there are often occurrences of this by some sort of issue with rabbits. All right. So hunters that hunt the rabbit and then are skinning the rabbits can potentially inoculate themselves if they've got a wound or if they get a little nick as they're skinning the rabbit and inoculate that organism into them. They can have issues like this. There have been accounts of individuals that have, unknowingly, riding lawnmowers or something like that. They run over a dead rabbit, and that basically aerosolizes stuff, and they can become infected that way. Numerous things, all right? Really kind of odd. There was a gentleman from around Soda Springs area a couple of years back. I think it was a lawnmower deal where he got infected with this. And as he wound up here at Portneuf, a friend of mine was working in the lab at the time, seeing some of this stuff, trying to cultivate it and whatever. Definitely an oddball, right? You expect to see handfuls of normal bacteria that are culprits. Francisella is something that you think about, but you don't really think you're going to see, right? It's kind of like, working in a lab here in Idaho and somebody comes in and you diagnose them with malaria. You didn't really expect that, right? Not in Idaho, right? But it does happen, all right? If you've traveled elsewhere, right? So he sees this, cultivates ultimately as they are first dealing with this stuff, even though, they're using precautions and gloved up and all of those things, it's still super contagious, right? And everyone that was working in the lab as that sample was being dealt with was quarantined and treated with antibiotics. Nobody got infected, but they were treated just to be careful, just to be cautious, all right? Kind of impressive, all right? Okay. So Yersinia pestis, the plague, we have talked a little bit about some of this before. There are all sorts of opportunities with the plague. Yersinia pestis, we think about as a kind of rodent flea sort of situation where it can cause the buboes that we will see in a bit with the lymphatic system being impacted, but there are other opportunities as well. There can be pneumonic and septicemic, dependent upon the circumstances. That can be definite serious concerns, possible fatal. And I think with the pneumonic plague, it's almost always fatal, right? So the idea with this, the fleas are the source of harboring the bacterium, feeding on all sorts of different things that can serve as some reservoirs to harbor that. The flea, as it ingests the Yersinia pestis, the bacterium gets into the gut of the flea, starts replicating, and it causes blockage. Now the flea basically can't get nutrients and is starving. So all it wants to do is feed, all right? So it can eat, but it can't digest. So it hops from one host to the next, trying to get blood meals. And every time it goes to feed, it also regurgitates up the bacteria. So it infects and tries to feed and infects over and over and over, lending to big issues, all right? Pretty impressive, all right? So for the poor little flea, it's gonna starve to death, even though it's constantly feeding, because it can't fully digest, and that lends to its likelihood of transmitting it even better. There's all sorts of opportunities as far as how we can see some transmission with this. The pneumonic can be some airborne transmission. We can see through the consumption of meat that is tainted with some of this. We could become infected as well. But typically we think about our little flea serving as the main player within this, all right? Rats oftentimes considered big culprits with that, and we can see this over here with the rodent situation, but there are others, all right? And we can see other things, although squirrels are a rodent, they're to me a little cuter than the rat, right? So these also can serve as potential issues with that, lending to transmission. So it definitely depends on your circumstances as far as what sorts of opportunities you have, all right? And with the normal bubonic plague, it is treatable. Kind of just depends. Although you look at this and you're like, is it really? It looks like you're dying, right? So here with Yersinia, we're looking at bubonic plague with this first bit right here is lymph node, inguinal lymph node, so groin, and we can see this swelling up. It potentially becomes necrotic and looks more like this as well, all right? They call it Black Death, and this makes sense, right? Every time I start talking about this, it makes me think of, Monty Python's Holy Grail and, bring out your dead, right? That's what we're talking about, right? So, and they're just like, but you're gonna be, right? Just get on the cart, right? So septicemic, here we can see necrotic toes. There's vascular damage. There's all sorts of issues. And as I said, if we progress and are thinking septic or pneumonic, prognosis is super poor, all right? So bad news. Here we can see a right stain. So right stain we use to image white cells. It's not a gram stain, all right? It gives us the opportunity to evaluate some of these and differentiate. As you can see, we got some variation here. A bunch of this right here all stacked up are a bunch of red blood cells. You don't really see them individually, but that's what they are. They're all kind of stacked on top of one another. And then the bacteria, the Yersinia pestis. These guys pick up what we call a bipolar staining, all right? So the tips of these rods pick up the stain and the center bit does not, all right? And we say kind of safety pin-like appearance, all right? Like I said, this isn't a gram stain, all right? If this was a gram stain, these things I would say are gram-positive, right? They look purple, all right? Yersinia is a gram-negative bacterium. If we gram-stained them, they would be pink, all right? But we're not gram-staining, all right? But if, not knowing what was up, if this was gram-stained, I would take a peek at this, and I would see this stuff right here and the hollow bit on the inside. And the first thing that would pop into my head is this is a potential spore-forming bacterium. That's what I would think, all right? And an endospore stain would show up negative because it's not a spore-forming bacterium. But that's what my gut would tell me, all right? Initially, I would be thinking, is this Clostridium? Is this potentially our gas gangrene? Because it's a gram-positive spore-forming bacterium, all right? But that's not what we're seeing, all right? So sometimes, and maybe when you guys gram-stained and you gram-stained up some bacillus, also a spore former, you could see in that gram stain hollow little bits inside, kind of in the center of that cell. That's the hint of that spore, right? That's what I'm talking about right here. That's kind of how it appears, all right? But it depends on how you're staining it, all right? So, like I said, it's if you gram stained, it would be a gram negative and non-spore formal, right? But that's kind of how it looks. All right, I will stop with that. We'll pick up Wednesday with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Good times.